Okay, we're covering Joshua 9 through 11, right? How many read 9, 10, 11, some portion of? Yeah, it's the history there. This is the core of what Joshua really is telling about for events. This is the history of it. And Israel had enjoyed great success at Jericho and eventually at Ai. So they were taking the promised land. And of course, the whole situation there with Jericho and Ai was they needed a bridgehead. They needed their D-Day success. You know, military theoreticians would say that if Hitler had immediately sent his panzer divisions to the front, he might well have held Germany. And that would have been crushing for the Allies to come up with another way. They would have had to go up out of Italy or something, and you got to go around Switzerland, and that would be a nightmare getting through the mountains anyway, one way or the other. But he delayed, and so D-Day was a success, and God was in it, I'm sure, in that case as well. And so God provided their success, their initial victory, and here too, God is specifically, pointedly, publicly announcing he is giving them this success. Jericho was destroyed because God tore down the walls. And Ai was a success only after they removed sin in the camp. So it was God's work throughout, and we see that over and over again. One of the words, if you go into like a concordance, one of the words you see repeatedly along these chapters that we're covering today is delivered. The Lord delivered. The Lord gave them the victory. And so here we see that same point. They're looking at a large collection of the major powers of Canaan. So in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, and it came to pass when all the kings which were on this side Jordan, now of course before, in the Pentateuch, this side Jordan means on the east side of Jordan, before you get into the promised land proper. You're in Gilead, also part of the promised land, but not really thought of in that term, not usually used in those terms. But now they're on the west side in Israel, so this side now means, well, the writer of Joshua was on the west side of Jordan, on the Jerusalem side of it, and so this side means on the west side of Jordan. So you got to realize context. You know, in literature class, in English class, and they said, well, you got to understand the context of this and where and what. Yeah, you do. This is very important. This changes depending on where they are. So they're on this side of Jordan. And going on from that verse then, in the hills and in the valleys and in all the coasts of the great sea over against Lebanon, the Hittite and the Amorite and the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard thereof, that they gathered themselves together to fight with Joshua and with Israel with one accord. Now, all of that land was theirs. The curse specifically was on the Canaanite, but there were other peoples living among them who were very much in agreement with them, and this just underlines that fact. These were all various peoples who had their towns and villages and main city for their culture among that area. They might have, 2 or 3 in an area, and that would be their homeland, that particular spot. But they worked together, and they were gathering, it says, verse 2, they gathered themselves together to fight with Joshua and with Israel with one accord. In the New Testament, it talks about that church at Jerusalem being of one accord. That's a good thing. Here, one accord is not such a good thing. In this world, those who do wickedness work with one accord. and you see it frequently, they have literally one message. And so when you go out looking for information, what's going on, you get one message. Oh, it must be true, everybody's saying it. No, they're in one accord. The devil's crowd can operate in one accord. And so here, we see verse 4, they did work wilily. They were wily, like in Wile E. Coyote. Wilily, and went and made as if, oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. That was those entering into battle. Okay, I jumped verse 3, the Gibeonites. The major peoples there were ready to do that. The Gibeonites were known as mighty people. They say that themselves, and that seems to be their name. And yet somehow when it came time to fight, they basically surrendered immediately. And so they went in wilily, verse 4 again. They did work wilily and went and made as if they had been ambassadors, and took old sacks upon their asses, that's their donkeys, to transport animals, and wine bottles old and rent and bound up, and old shoes and clouded upon their feet. In other words, they were just barely tied to their feet enough to be under their feet. Clouted upon their feet, and old garments upon them, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. They're making it look like, oh, we came from so far away. And I read that and I think, okay, like the 3 wise men, nothing in the Bible about their food being bad, but this was, one of those exaggerated things. The world knows how to couch its position for laying deceit. The press had a bias from way back, but you had to look awfully hard at it. Now it's right up front. A political figure who is liberal gets well played in the press, and a conservative will be automatically guilty of whatever. It's the way it works. And so they try to depict something that isn't so. There was a reporter killed this last month. They brought in a political official, low-level county something or other. But he ran on a label of a Democrat. It wasn't a Democrat program, but he was in the Democrat Party. So the press's information was what? Oh, isn't this Trump's fault? What? Where was he? But they needed to label it. Case in point. So you have to look at what are the real facts. Whenever the police do their work, whenever the district attorney does their work, depending on what county and place, they gather information first. Nobody's accused of anything. They're a person of interest. Very often in the press, they've got them tried and hung. As soon as somebody says, oh, this could be applied to so-and-so. Oh, yeah, it's them. They're to blame. And they'll do that in Facebook and love it. Treat it like, when you're hearing of these things, like you're the police and the district attorney. We're just gathering information. Do we have the DNA? Do we have a fingerprint? Well, sometimes you don't. But you can find enough evidence of it. What are the facts? What is known? They come in, they're lying. Wilily there, it is also used in Proverbs in one place, and it's translated as simple or simplicity. I forget which. I looked it up. But basically, it can be a good thing. If we as Christians come to God simply trusting Him and reading His Word, take His Word and its authority and His knowledge in simplicity, I know that God is true. If it goes against God's Word, it goes against God, it's not. Real simple. Simplicity. And that's the kind of word that this is, but here it's using it in terms of there being worldly wise. Just like Rahab, they're sitting there going, oh, this is not good. These guys win. You know, it's the pro football team against the little sisters of the poor. You know, it ain't going to go well. So they're looking for, we've got to deceive them. And so in verse 8, and they said unto Joshua, we are thy servants. And verse 9, they said unto him, from a very far country thy servants are come, because the name of the Lord the Lord thy God, we have heard this fame of him and all that he did in Egypt. Somehow that sentence structure is sounding odd to me. I was looking for an extra word in there as well. But in any case, they pretended they were from far off. Kind of like I say, the three wise men. So God supplied them the victories, but now they're sitting there saying, oh, we can win every fight. We're all set. No worry, no problem. Like sending only 3,000 men at Ai back in the prior lesson. They were overconfident. When they went back, Joshua counted out 30,000 and set 5,000 as one group for one part of a larger military operation. So here it was again. They're overconfident. So anyway, last part of verse 11. We are your servants, therefore now make ye a league with us. Verse 14 and 15. And the men took their, and that word again, we've seen it before, victuals. It's pronounced victuals. It looks like victuals. Well, the Beverly Hillbillies, if you ever watched that show, they pronounce it correctly and then spell it incorrectly. This is how it's spelled, but it's pronounced victuals. The men took their victuals and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a league with them to let them live. And the princes of the congregation swear unto them. They took an oath. They entered into a treaty with someone they shouldn't be entering into a treaty with. And the Gibeonites, we find later, verse 17, they actually had 4 cities. There were 3 others. Three others besides that, and they were all basically southwest of Jerusalem toward what would be now Gaza. Not necessarily in that same exact geography. I can't find anything where it overlays this era with that to be able to determine those cities with the political divisions now, but it's down in that form. It's toward the Mediterranean. Heading back toward Egypt along the shore, but not on the shore necessarily. They were all basically on low plains, coastal cities. And here, they took a huge, they were deceived, but they were being gullible, and that was on them. They didn't ask of God. In most anything we do, we should pray. Pray for God's blessing in it, if nothing else. Be sure of what needs to be and why. And ask God's wisdom in it. Sometimes you go into something and, I'd hope for better, but this is God's will in it. I'm sure of that. We're going to do this. And there are other times you can sit there and say, oh, this is going to be wonderful, and yeah, it isn't. Especially when you're dealing with the world. Gibeonites, where were they from? A lot closer than they thought. They were part of the peoples that they should have been taking a hard line against. And mind you, looking through Scripture, it seems the Gibeonites, after these days, they get to be a little bit of a complication because basically they broke ranks with that group of kings that had their conference there in verse 1. They didn't look at who these people were, and they had broke ranks, and so those kings went against Gibeon right off the get-go. Israel was drawn into a battle there and then strung out along that. So here in chapter 9, they're in the battle now. They don't realize it. This is a preliminary, and the devil's crowd has set their agenda for them of where they're going to go first. Now, Joshua here he's not one of the priesthood. He's not part of the Levites. He was of Ephraim. One of the two tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, were the sons of Joseph, who were given their own tribes. He was of that crowd, but he was still a spiritual leader. He was their authority, and he was the one that should speak to God and get that info, and he didn't. When we look at what her political leaders do, we would hope they would seek God. I'll guarantee you they all too often, way too much of the time, I'm afraid, don't. They make plans. I love it when they make plans about what's going to happen when their term is up. You got no authority, you're not king. We're going to have electric cars, just like California. We're going to have electric cars in New York, I guess, by 2033. Who's going to be governor? She's got to get through this election. And it's close or maybe not, depending on which poll you believe in. Al? Yeah, the Gibeonites, yeah.
Of all the tribes like that, or all the kings that, fought against Israel and kicked them out, they were the only ones like that actually
Yes.
survived. And plus two is that they were made hewers of wood for water, so
That comes up, yeah. Yeah, that comes up in this chapter. They still, Israel shouldn't have been making any agreements with them, right? Okay, that's the point. We're still waiting to really, all the votes are not in on the idea of having all this electricity. California is already up against it because they don't have the electricity supply for what they need for just the air conditioners. And, oh, by the way, apart from, well, around here we've got the electric coming off of Niagara Falls. You go somewhere else, they're burning coal and natural gas or oil. So they're still using fossil fuels. So let's just, it's firmly planted in midair as a policy. It's not there yet. There's all kinds of political intent, but it's not practical at this point for sure, with all the talk. Right, Al? Okay, you had your hand up. Was that it? What?
Yeah, two things like that is how long does that take to have every house with solar power on their houses
Mm-hmm.
convert them from, like you say, burning coal.
Yeah.
It's going to take years in order to change all that.
There are supply problems with all of this. We're not going to use oil. We're not going to use fossil fuels. There are huge supply problems because of what it takes to make those things and to maintain them and what it does for costs. Case in point, our food's going up in part, all across the country, in part because oil is more expensive. Even if they didn't raise the minimum wage like we did in New York, the price goes up. It all we pay ourselves. There is no free money. We pay ourselves. We got to pay the kids working in the stores. So our grocery bill went up. Simple as that. But try to find them. Yeah, well, they have to cut down the numbers of people. That's a whole other thing. Prayer. Joshua didn't pray. We should pray about anything we would do in our lives. We think, oh, this is right here, it's a easy thing. The Gibeonites said, oh yeah, we're from a far distant place. It's so far off, we won't be any problem at all. They were a problem immediately. So verse 16, at the end of 3 days, after they had made a league with them, that they heard that they were neighbors and that they dwelt among them. And in verse 17, it mentions now their cities. I'm reading the second half of these verses. Their cities were Gibeon and Chephirah and Beeroth and Kirjath-Jearim, which you hear that name frequently in the Old Testament. It's one of those cities that's kind of like on the southern edge, heading toward the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt. So it's a given reference point that far south. So they had the far southern areas in much of this. In any case, verse 23, and this is the future for the Gibeonites. Verse 23, now therefore ye are cursed, and these are Joshua's words, and there shall none of you be freed from being bondmen and hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. So you will hear of their name mentioned in concert with construction, and specifically with the tabernacle and temple. They were going to be servants as a people. They had their own cities, but we're going to raise a few hundred more people to do this, coming out of the Gibeonite cities. Chapter 10. These will go quickly. These are military operations. We will cover a little bit on it. Chapter 10, verse 1. Now it came to pass when Adoni-Zedek. Does that sound familiar? I'm pronouncing it a little harder on the vowels than we do, but in Genesis 13, Melchizedek. He was the king of Jerusalem. Here we have again the king of Jerusalem, but this man is against the will of God. Melchizedek recognized who Abraham was, and Abraham recognized him. This guy says, oh, you Jews, no, you're politically inconvenient for me. I'm against you. A lot of politicians that way, aren't they? Verse 1, chapter 10. Now it came to pass when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, had heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and her king, so he had done to Ai and her king. And now the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city and one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all the men thereof were mighty. So Gibeon was a powerful city, and they just figured, well, we're going to lose our power if we keep this up. It mentions their cities. In verse 3, they were southern cities. Verse 8, and the Lord said unto Joshua, fear them not, for I have delivered them into thine hand. God provided, God delivered, God made certain of this. God was giving them the victory. It mentions in verses 10 and 11 that they went up the way, the last part of verse 10, they goeth up to Beth Horon and smote them to Zedek unto Makkedah. And it came to pass as they fled from before Israel and were in the going down to Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven. Those three cities, they are very southern part along the Mediterranean. They're starting to flee north. The first two, or the last two there, were along the coast. Beth Horon was along more in the mountains, the hills. And so that would be Jerusalem maybe fleeing, heading north and going toward the coast, and the other cities were fleeing northward. There's my geographic note for you, my penchant for geography. But key part, last part of verse 11, the Lord cast down great stones from heaven. It wasn't fire and brimstone, but it was pretty good. There was mountainous area there. I don't know that there was mountainous enough area to do that kind of work. I think the Lord was literally picking up stones from just the general geography of the area and throwing them at them. Catapult, okay. The host of heaven, over on that side, give them a treatment, barrage. Can you imagine being someone of that era, 1400 BC, and you see a rock missile coming at you? 1800s, Civil War era and such, cannon fire became deadly. Troops running at each other would find themselves horribly decimated. Pickett's charge, they weren't going to make it. Too many cannons, too much open ground. and then the Gatling gun, early machine gun. God had his own kind of massive fire and such. That was the first point on God's intervention. God was giving them the victory. Look at verses 12 and 13. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, Son, now mind you, he's saying this, giving a command with everybody hearing him. Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and hasted not to go down about a whole day. The book of Jasher would have been a book of that era, which by all appearances was not scripture. It did not survive time, but it was an historical note of that day, like saying on this side of Jordan. It's a reference point. Key thing here, God gave them the extra time. In my mind, in the New Testament, it says, let not the sun go down upon thy wrath. Okay? Be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon thy wrath. If there's a battle in it, it's not you, it's the Lord. There is a right and wrong here. Don't let the sun go down. Now, sin not. If it's you, it's your enemy, not God's enemy. That's a whole different deal. Okay? That's a key point in New Testament. Al?
Is that a miracle if the sun stood still?
I would think, yes. The point here, though, the sun doesn't think about it now. I know centuries past there were people who said that was a scientific proof that the sun goes around the earth. I think we're pretty sure that isn't the case. It would make it really tough to be able to work out what they're doing with the satellites and whatnot, going places and Mars and back, if the sun's moving differently than what they understand it to be doing. So this, understand, is phrased in terms of how did it look to them? The sun stood still. Okay, did the earth stop spinning, or did God bend the light so that the sun's light kept shining on them? Doesn't matter. Either way, it's a miracle. I look at it and think, making the light bend like in a prism, and it splits out, all the various parts of the light bend a different direction a little bit. Yeah, it would have been a simpler thing scientifically to do, but if you stop the earth, then you've got to keep everything together for the earth and then start it back up. That would have been a unique point and place in time. Some try to tie this along with a passage in Isaiah to, take a day out of the calendar or something like that, and I'm thinking, unnecessary? It's speculation either way. And frankly, if God literally stopped the earth from spinning so it was shining on them, the fact that it would take an extra miracle for it to work out works just fine with me because it's God's power anyway. So it's all speculation. The point was they got the extra time. Oh, and by the way, they point to the same kind of miracles being reported in that area of the world and in the Americas. Now, I'm not sure of the days or the times. I'm sitting there going, that was the other side of the globe. They would have been in darkness extra long, not daytime extra long. So now you got a whole other thing. I don't know if that ties to it or if that was something where later on the devil tried to duplicate, like the devil duplicated the signs that God gave through Moses and Aaron to Egypt, and the magicians there in Egypt duplicated some things, couldn't duplicate others. God wouldn't let them. But this is all just like, this is a miracle. For them, at that time, there was something that they needed, that others had an extra few hours to do something because they had to pay a bill by sunset. That's nice. The rain falls on the just and the unjust, but this was rainfall especially for Israel there, and that was their help. And then how it might have gone for others in that same area, who knows? Yes, Deb?
In the Rader, he said that unusual refraction of the sun's rays.
Ah,
There were more daylight hours, but not more hours in a day. Another view supposed a prolonging of semi-darkness to give Joshua's men relief from the blazing sun.
okay.
Like God sending an unusual summer hailstorm.
Summer hailstorm. Where's the hailstorm? The rocks? Exactly. Once you can sit there and say, there's this and that. What's it saying? But you know what? You're right. Bottom line is God intervened miraculously and gave them that victory. Absolutely. So, verse 26, now the kings tried to hide in a cave. They went and beat them and took them, and it says, and afterward Joshua smote them and slew them and hanged them on 5 trees, and they were hanging upon the trees until evening. Then they cut them down. So the rest of the chapter, it mentions them going from city to city. Libnah, God delivered it also. And the Lord, verse 32, and the Lord delivered Lachish. And verse 33, and Gezer. They came up to help. They got beaten. Verse 34, Joshua passed on to Aglon and all Israel with him. So they're basically just rolling through these cities. Now, it mentions them in very quick order. But those could have been, unless specifically said, they could have been a particularly long time in between. Joshua died at, as I recall, 110 years of age. So, yeah, this was not, and he was 60, 70, 80, starting at the beginning of Joshua. Chapter 11, then, the kings of the north. It mentions Hazer. That would be in far north of the Sea of Galilee. And then cities named Madon, Shimron, and Akshaph. Yeah, I had to look them up. They're all basically up in the north. Hazer's in the mountains. The rest of them would be basically west of the Sea of Galilee, heading toward the Mediterranean, that area. So verse 6, and the Lord said to Joshua, be not afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time will I deliver them up, all slain before Israel. Verse 8, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel. Last part of verse 8, they left none remaining. Verse 9, and Joshua did unto them as the Lord bade him, and that word Hough, I'm sitting there going, how do you pronounce that? I had to look it up. It's apparently some sort of a Scottish word. It's pronounced hock. We would spell it Hock, I think. But here, what it's saying, hock, basically he cut their Achilles tendons or somehow messed them up. Yeah, basically they weren't going to be good for any sort of battle for sure anymore. So their cavalry, their chariots were done away with. He poured sugar in the tanks of their tanks, is basically what it amounted to. Yeah, it ruins them for it. Depending on how and the way it was done, I don't know if that made them, permanently unable, or if they could be bound so they could at least walk. But, yeah, they weren't going to battle anymore. Verse 13, but as for the cities that stood still in their strength, in other words, the cities, they had beaten the armies of these people. Israel burned none of them, save Hazer only. That did Joshua burn. And so, verse 18, Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. Then, verse 22, last verse, there was none of the Anakims. Those were the giants that the parents were so worried about. Think Goliath later on. There were none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. And I think Gath would be what is associated with Goliath. But in any case, God gave them these victories. They didn't wipe out every town. They didn't have that obligation. The Lord wanted them to leave these peoples in place unless they wanted the land. And they should have wiped them out, gotten them out of there. But they should have left them in place to take care of the wild animals. We're running out of time. We will cover, if you look at the lesson plan, it's chapters 12 through 22 for next week. Yeah, no, we're not covering that many chapters. A lot of them are, and this tribe got this land, and this tribe got this land, and this tribe. So as you go through it, you'll see that. Basically, chapter 12, first half of chapter 13, chapter 14, and then you can skip to chapter 22. Okay? Chapter 14 is Caleb, and chapter, we'll get to them. But a lot of those in between are things like what the tribes got and the cities of refuge, what the Levites got, and that sort of thing. Al? That was in there. Yeah. Basically, it was to encourage them. These great kings that your parents worried about, yeah, you've got your foot on their necks. Yeah.
Another thing is, in the Civil War, more men were killed than World War I and World War II together.
Well, more Americans. More Americans, yes. Because it was Americans against Americans. No matter what happened, it was probably an American that was dying in the Civil War, yes. Certainly. And we're way over time. A quick prayer, and we will be dismissed. Lord God, we thank you for your word, for its counsel, Lord. May we be mindful to look to your word, to your will, to know the right and wrong, to know what is advantageous and what is harmful, what is your will and what would not serve, Lord, that we'd not be tripped up in these things, that we would be wise in your way and not deceived by the wiles of the world. We look for your blessing in this in Christ's name. Amen.